When it comes to things that make us both unsettled and intrigued, obscurity and uncertainty are the core of a good mystery. I'm sure for many of you viewing that's quite obvious. I might sound like a fool even saying it, but that doesn't make it any less truthful. Even beyond the realm of horror, mysteries, puzzles, humans are drawn to the intrigue of uncertainty, and sometimes the challenge to figure it out. Whether or not it's reasonable they could get their answers, or if such answers even exist. While it's a major part of the threats in real life that truly scare us, it's also a big part of the horror art we create. One kind that has always been of interest to me is the urban legend. What may start with a nugget of truth, but in time, eventually changes and mutates as it spreads through word of mouth and is passed around so much that people have to question what, if anything at all, was so truthful about it. Even if, most of the time, the sad answer is nothing at all. While the term urban legend may not be as prevalent today as it once was, its ideas still go strong under new names and new forms. It's probably just a constant of human nature to lie out of your ass for fun. Today we call that spreading misinformation. Tonight I have two legends concerning obscure topics, ones that never even in their time were called urban legends, but I feel were always the same in spirit at least. They may be more familiar to some of you under a different name. Creepypasta. Both are almost certainly fictitious accounts of non-existent games. One not so great, and one much better, but both are personal favorites of mine. Both share some similar fundamentals, but are vastly different in other ways, and I want to compare the two and how they achieve their goals effectively. I'll discuss the stories, but first I want to read them. If you've already heard them, or just for whatever reason don't feel like hearing my take on the story, whyever that might be, I'll leave a timestamp so you can just skip right ahead to the parts you want to see. But without further ado, let me start with tonight's first story. Mr. Mix. Does anybody remember an old PC game from the early 1990s called Mr. Mix? It was mainly a typing game, similar to Mario Teaches Typing, where you have to put words into a box to make a chef, the titular Mr. Mix, place ingredients into a bowl. Unlike most typing games, however, the game was notorious for having an insane difficulty curve. It had a words per minute requirement for each level, being as low as 10 on level 1 and as high as 85 on the third. By level 5, the requirement reaches over 500, effectively making it impossible to proceed any further. One of the main things that people immediately noticed about the game was the background music. On the first level, it was an unsettling pattern of growls that got progressively louder as the level went on, often causing damage to early computer speakers that were not designed to handle extremely high volumes. The second level had no music at all, and the third had what sounded like a very low quality recording of a hairdryer playing in the background. The remaining two levels had an incredibly loud, high-pitched ringing throughout that caused severe eardrum damage to those who managed to get that far. Another rather disturbing aspect of the game was the design of Mr. Mix himself. He was a large, round-faced and overweight man with beady eyes and red spots on his cheeks. Most children who played the game reported having vivid nightmares of Mr. Mix speaking to them in a quiet, raspy voice and threatening them to keep quiet about something. However, none of them could remember exactly what that was. One psychologist who saw many of these children reported being disturbed by the sheer amount of terror on their faces as they recounted the details of the nightmare. Many of them broke down into tears in the process, begging for their parents to save them. However, no direct relationship to the game itself could be determined by these few cases, as not all the children suffered the same adverse effects. For obvious reasons, the game did not sell very well. It remained in relative obscurity until a few years ago when PC hackers got a hold of a ROM of it and started digging through. Using memory hacking software, they managed to crack the game's code and bypass the impossible fifth level. What they found, however, was highly disturbing, and it caused many of them to quit the expedition altogether. According to the reports these hackers left behind, the game behaves very strangely if the fifth level is bypassed. The game crashes violently and closes, writing a bunch of files to the user's System32 directory to the point that the RAM is almost completely filled. These files are reportedly pictures of people with horribly deformed faces appearing to scream in pain and agony, their eyes bleeding from their tear ducts and their outer layer of skin torn clean off in multiple places. If the user attempts to delete these files, the computer will violently crash on blue screen, causing permanent, irreparable damage to the hard drive. The hackers found that this was caused by a lone byte in the game's ROM that triggered when the 5th level was completed. After removing this byte, they were able to proceed to the 6th and final level. Unfortunately, all of the hackers declined to discuss what they saw on the final level. Each of them became extremely paranoid and reclusive afterwards, refusing to talk about anything related to the game and showing astonishingly extreme symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of them ceased to be able to form coherent thoughts within a week. Within a month, all of them had gone missing. All remaining copies of the game were destroyed. To this day, no one knows what was in it that caused the group so much psychological damage. Maybe it's better that way. 2 years after this incident, a man was arrested for trying to kidnap an 8-year-old girl from a grocery store. Through DNA and fingerprint analysis, he was identified as one of the original hackers who had viewed the final levels of the game. He was wearing a white chef's hat and had a look of unspeakable malice and insanity on his face. When interrogated, the man would only say one thing: "I'm Mr. Mix." Shh. You might have noticed that I left in the take where I'm almost laughing at that final line, and that's because I feel like it's kind of fitting of my thoughts on this creepypasta. I really do like some of the concepts that it has, but man, let's start with the obvious. There's the gore and scary images in the game that it might not be at the level of hyper-realistic eyes that some other creepypastas are, but it's definitely cliche and just not great. I don't think I need to explain to most of you of how hyper-realistic eyes and gore in these kinds of stories was a huge cliche that never really worked. It rarely services these stories and, more often than not, just drags them down. They don't really do anything in the bounds of the narrative to pay things off, nor are they really written or described in a way that actually gives you as the audience, like, something to be scared of. They'll just be basic descriptions that lack enough detail to really make you imagine something unsettling unless you have a really active imagination. In Mr. Mix, it kinda just comes out of nowhere with the whole suggestion just being, it's a scary game so it has to have something scary. The descriptions aren't particularly shocking. Sure, having your skin torn off isn't nice, but I don't feel like it does anything for the narrative or for the scare factor, especially because it's so vague you don't really get forced to think of any more detail than you have to. I don't think I would have gone with a gore direction had I written it, but I feel like if you're going to try that, mixing it in more uniquely with the narrative itself I think would have done a lot more. Like, the people I mentioned to be skinned, within the context of a game about someone who's cooking and baking things, sure, it would still be cliche to do it, but you could at least try and incorporate that a bit by suggesting that maybe they had their skin cut off by a butcher, or that they were going to be used at a meal. Something that's at least a little more, personalized to this story. I'm also not tech savvy enough myself to confirm this, but I've heard people say that this just isn't how System 32 would work. I think the idea the game bricks your system is pretty interesting if, again, a little cliche. I just think it'd be good to be vague about it, especially not to make details that end up being mistakes. And I think it's interesting if you leave it up to interpretation if it's a malicious act by the developers or incompetent coding. I'm not just going to criticize, but I don't even want to mention that ending. It's something where I don't know if the concept itself could even work, but the execution sticks with you for the wrong reason. It's a little cliche and it doesn't really tap into anything unique about this story, just doing the standard, this game is scary, therefore it must make people go insane. I did say this is still kind of a personal favorite of mine, and while some of that is just laughing at the absurdity it gets to, I think the concept is pretty good. I've heard some people criticize the absurd difficulty spike, and I think maybe you could tweak it around to be not something so extreme, but I actually think that's a pretty good concept. It's not super common, but I definitely have some childhood memories of playing a game that gets really absurdly difficult towards the end, especially for a target audience of kids. Now, I think making it so absurdly impossible that no one can clear it might be a bit much, but I think there's a lot of potential with the idea that this edutainment game that's meant for really young kids just suddenly gets to a point that it's kind of unreasonable to expect them to finish it, and no one beyond the target audience, like an adult, would ever really consider playing it, so the game just kind of goes unfinished until one or two adults realize that, no one's ever beaten it. Maybe a kid grows up and realizes they never finished it. And maybe there's plenty of levels that are just further and further beyond what even a reasonable adult would be expected to do, and then maybe towards the end you have a level that's just so absurd that either the game just can't function properly, or it's a level of words per minute that no one can achieve. I think saying it's hard, but then front-loading the story with it's already impossible is a little silly. I also know, though, that these are creepypastas and they generally go on the shorter side, but maybe with the right pacing or just running it a little bit longer, you could go into the idea of there being more levels to it and more meat to the story overall. You can use that to sprinkle in more strange details too. Like, imagine if the music only gets strange in the later levels that are more difficult for younger kids. Maybe suggest the game is just buggy or these are unfinished levels before you get more inclinations that maybe it's something sinister. Overall, there's potential, but it's more funny than it is scary. Now, before I move on, I just want to say, in regards to this and the next story, when I give my feedback, I'm no expert, and I'm not fixing the story. Here, I fixed it for you. These were stories made for fun on the internet, and here I am, some asshole with a mic on the internet, talking about them. I don't know any better than them, and while I think my fixes could make a good story on their own and potentially improve these stories, it's presumptuous for me to assume or say that I'm a better writer than these people are. I'm providing feedback and my own thoughts as to what could potentially make a story that better hits the vibes I feel like they wanted to go for with this one, but just about all art, even if it's bad, deserves to exist. The valuable experience in art is making something with your own voice and just flexing your creative muscles. I'm glad that works like Mr. Mix exists, even if they're not great, because I still enjoy them regardless and they still leave me with something to think about. That's the most important part. I'm sure the authors of this were probably fine people, and this was a story they wrote for fun that hopefully taught them some things. Like, as long as you're not like the author of Sonic.exe, you don't really deserve to get harassed. As I said in the intro, it's far from the only tale on the internet that covers a allegedly lost and mysterious game that has some quite sinister things going on in it. Our next one being one that may not be so overtly sinister, but is still unsettling in its own ways. Let me stop selling it to you though, let's just get right into it. Have you ever heard of an old PC game called The Theater? Yeah, I didn't think so. Probably because many people say it doesn't even exist. You see, The Theater is an old computer game released around the same time as Doom. Today, if you ever find it, it's only available on crappy bootleg CD-ROMs, which, more often than not, don't even actually contain the game. The actual legitimate copies that they say were released back in the day feature a blank cover with nothing but the sprite of what has since been named the Tickettaker. He is simply a poorly drawn, pixelated Caucasian bald man with large red lips wearing a red vest over a white shirt and black pants. He is completely emotionless, though some say if you smash the disc, his face is shown as angry the next time you look at the cover. But this is just dismissed as an urban myth. What is peculiar about The Theater, though, is that there's no developer named on the jewel case, nor a game description on the back. It's simply the Tickettaker on a white backdrop on both sides. The game was initially known for its inability to install correctly. The installation process immediately locks up the computer when the user reaches the licensing agreement. Also strange about the licensing agreement for The Theater is that whenever the development studio is supposed to be named, the text is simply a blank line. Anyways, most people who have claimed to own one of the CDs say they figured out how to install the game by simply rebooting their computer on the licensing agreement with the disc still inside. Then they are prompted to press I agree on startup. Then they continue on the installation. The game then starts up without any introduction, besides a main menu that is simply the sprite of a movie theater's exterior on an empty city street. The title fades in, and then the three menu buttons, New Game, Load, Options. Selecting Options immediately crashes the game to the desktop. Load is said to not function at all. Even if you do have a saved game, nothing happens when you press it. Thus, New Game is the only working menu option. Once it is selected, you're in the first-person view. You are standing in an empty movie theater lobby, with the exception of the Tickettaker standing in front of a dark hallway which one can only assume leads to the theaters themselves. There's nothing to do but look at the poorly drawn, mostly illegible movie posters, or approach the Tickettaker. Once the player moves towards the Tickettaker, a very low-quality sound clip plays, saying,
"Thank you. Please enjoy the movie."
Along with the speech box saying the same thing. You then walk back into the hallway, and the screen fades to black, and you're back in the empty lobby, and you do the exact same thing again and again and again. Well, this might sound like a really horrible game. A number of peculiar things occur as you continue to play it. The number of times you have to continue in the hall after giving your ticket to the Tickettaker before the strange events happen is unknown. Most state that it's completely random and could take anywhere from the first playthrough to the 400th. What happens, though, has deeply disturbed some players. The first occurrence is when the player fades back in after walking into the hallway. This time, they'll notice the Tickettaker is completely absent. The player then, without any options, decides to walk into the dark hallway. The sound clip and the text box mentioned previously still play in the absence of the Tickettaker, but when the player walks into the hallways, the screen does not fade out. It goes pitch black as they walk deeper into the hall, but the player's footstep sound clip is still playing as they continue to push the up button on their keyboard. Those claiming to have played the original game report to have felt extremely uncomfortable walking down the hallway, anticipating the whole way something horrible happening. Well, eventually the player is unable to move forward. There's nothing for a few moments before a strange sprite that is described as the Tickettaker but with a squirrel for a face appears and stands before the player. The original players of the game say their bodies immediately froze up and their stomachs churned when they saw the sprite, which has appropriately been named the Swirly Head Man. Nothing happens as the Swirly Head Man stands before them. Then, suddenly, a piercing screech plays as the game glitches out. This lasts for a few minutes, with the screech being continuous. Then, the players abruptly return to the lobby, with all sounds and graphics being as they should. The game continues normally for the next couple of cycles of entering the hallway, with a couple of the original players claiming that the Swirly Head Man would briefly appear and disappear in the corner of the screen, as a brisk yelp sound effect plays. Then, at some point after meeting the Swirly Head Man, the player sees the Tickettaker pacing back and forth. Though there is no walking animation, the sprite's limbs are completely static, so he just hops up and down slightly as a substitute. With his eyes being wide and his mouth open to simulate a worried facial expression. Some players noted that the movie poster has been replaced with images of the Swirly Head Man, which caused them to immediately turn their character's head away from the posters and approach the Tickettaker. Then another different, low-quality sound clip plays, but the speech box contains nothing but corrupted characters that cause whatever text that would have been in the box to be completely illegible. Due to the extreme low quality of the sound, it is debated by players what exactly the Tickettaker says at this point, though it is widely agreed that he says,
Never reach the other levels.
Then the screen fades out once again and returns the player back to their starting point in the lobby, but the Tickettaker is gone and the hallway is blocked by a large brick wall sprite. Touching the brick wall will immediately crash the game. And that's all there is to it. No one knows what the other levels are or how to gain access to them, nor is it known why the Swirly Head Man causes such acute fear in those who have seen him in the game. All the original copies of the theater have either been lost or destroyed. But the creepiest part is the fact that all the original players of the game claim to occasionally see a brief glimpse of the Swirly Head Man out of the corner of their eyes. Now, while this is far from perfect, I think this does a lot better with the ideas it has compared to the last one. I think for one, the concept of the theater feels almost more and less believable at the same time, which makes this a game with a more overtly obvious gameplay function. It's a typing game. It's something you play to learn. The theater is weird. The game, as it said in the pasta, doesn't really have gameplay. It's a first-person game where you simply go down a hallway to enter a theater. Even if it functioned with you entering the movie theater and watching something, that's still not a compelling game, but at the same time, given it's supposed to be a PC game from around the time of Doom, that feels a little plausible. There could have been gameplay to it. I've heard some retakes and also just speculation adding on to the whole mythos that perhaps it was a puzzle game or something of the like, but I think part of that ambiguity is what works in the story. It feels just enough like a game that could have existed, but with the information we're given objectively in the story, we have no clue what the gameplay could have been, if there really was any gameplay to it at all. And back to the idea of questions and obscurity, there's something that it does very well, which is not make it a game that is suggested to be publicly available. It's not just that it's an obscure release, but it seems to be completely lost. That's a little cliche in its own right, but for what the story is trying to achieve, which is make you question what's up with the game, that works a bit better. You see, with Mr. Mix, I feel like because the game isn't suggested to be lost, it's just obscure and weird. And especially when you have a group of hackers in the story, you can't have the ambiguity of what is or isn't in the game. Instead, you have to make what's in the game creepy, and the direction that goes is simply by adding gore. Now, it wouldn't have been impossible to just make the game's contents creepy as well, but the theater goes a different route, going deeper into the idea of obscurity. It suggests that the game could be an urban legend outright, and all we have to go off of are the accounts of people who've allegedly played the game. I even like how at the start, there's that whole little bit about the case where if you allegedly break it, the Tickettaker looks mad, but the author dismisses it as an urban legend. It's absurd, and I don't think it's the story trying to be scary. I think it's the story trying to insert a little bit of reality. It feels just enough like the kind of bogus but ooh kind of scary thing that someone would say with a real myth like this. It makes me think of the sort of thing like when the Mario 64 iceberg and the whole creepy phenomenon around that game kicked off, or things like anti-piracy screens where as it got bigger and bigger and more people got in on it, we had people that, no offense, didn't really have the best idea at expressing horror, or were just really young and obviously didn't really know how to make people scared yet. You get bogus stuff like a piracy screen where Mario's got bloody eyes saying he's gonna kill you, where it's neither scary in an overt sense, nor scary in a it could be real sense. I like too that it feels like the narrator isn't 1000% trying to scare you. It does feel like they're trying to relay a story. From what the website creepypasta.com and some other accounts say, the narrative started on 4chan's X Paranormal board, so it explains some of the style of writing. I like how it feels a little more personable and like someone trying to convince us for the myth, but there's also a part of me that feels like towards the end, it goes a little more into just trying to relay these scary things with a sort of objective lean, and I feel like it loses that specific voice the narrator could have had. That's not a huge gripe, but it just makes it start to feel a little more like any other creepypasta where it's just describing the weird and scary things in the game. And speaking of the scares, going back to the whole Mario 64 phenomenon, I think this actually reminded me, reading it today, with games like that, especially after the iceberg trend, people kind of try and catalog all that's going on with them that's strange. I also thought of the ROM hack B3133, LSD Dream Emulator, and Yume Nikki, all games about just experiencing strange events. The way the creepypasta is written makes me think that the theater would fall into that kind of category of game, which is a group of games that I've always really loved and I know have a really strong cult following. It feels like if the theater were real, it would be the kind of game to really be investigated. It isn't just that you play the game once and scary things happen, it's that there's an unknowable amount of strange things that could happen. It does run into that problem that any gaming creepypasta does of how do you make the horror real and long-term instead of it just being like any other horror game, with the theater's attempt at an answer for that being the swirly head man. I have mixed thoughts on him because I feel like, especially how I picture him in my mind, it's not really the scariest thing. At the same time, I could sort of understand a bit of unsettlingness with his design. I prefer the fan depictions where it's less that he's just got a swirly texture, and it's more like his actual face has been kind of deformed into a swirl. I appreciate that the story doesn't go too out of its way to try and make it seem like he's the scariest thing ever, but it still suggests that, for whatever reason, the players are deeply unsettled by him. And again, the ending still kinda is a 50-50 for me. I think going with the idea that just for some reason his presence is disturbing to people, it kind of works, but it still does feel like a little cliche, the monster's so scary you think about it in real life! It's not as overt, it's not a story ruiner like it is in other stories, but it's still a little iffy for me. Would playing the theater scare me is a question where I thought the answer would be definitely not, and I still think it probably isn't a hard yes, but I feel like thinking about the descriptions, it would be the sort of thing where if I played it on a dark night, and especially if I saw things I wasn't prepared for, it would definitely get under my skin a little bit. The idea of seeing the swirly head man at the end of a dark hallway, it sounds silly when described objectively, and if you're not really in a mood of any tension, yeah, it doesn't do much, but I could see something like that and thinking about those old graphics and just being in the mind state of a game I don't know enough about that's old, creepy, completely underreported on the internet, and it could definitely get to me a little bit, I think. That's the thing, that horror in general is such a subjective thing based on people's moods, the things they've experienced before in the past, and how they're feeling in that current moment. Plus the people who like to parade around and declare how they're so not scared of things that are meant to be scary, and they're above people who find these things unsettling. Guys, I could beat Hello Neighbor with the lights off. Aren't I awesome? It won't work for everybody. All art is subjective and not gonna please everybody, especially a genre that's polarizing like horror. And I feel there's people that will just not enjoy something if it can't scare them, and that's fine, just don't be a dickhead. And when it comes to creepypastas, especially gaming ones, and especially ones like the theater, there's also a large level of abstraction that can really be make or break. It might create more than enough room for imagination and filling in the blanks for people to run wild with it and absolutely love it, but it will also not work for somebody just due to how much abstraction there is. It's a fake story of fake stories of a fake video game. That's a lot of degrees of disconnect. Again, it's fair to feel both ways about it, as long as we're just having productive and civil discussions about it, and not being mean because of story on the internet is or isn't scary to us. Personally, I think what appeals to me about the theater is just that room for so much more, the can of worms it sort of opens. As my channel probably suggests, I really like me a good mysterious rabbit hole, especially in the art we make. Yes, that mostly is video games too. I feel like if the theater were real, it would be the kind of game that I'm paying a lot of attention to what people engage with it. I don't know if I would or could be the kind of person who would really look into it myself, but I'd be the kind of person where I would shit my pants every time we discover a new event where the Tickettaker spills popcorn or something. One last little bit of feedback is that part of me would have enjoyed if the story had a little more details on if the game was, say, intentionally unfinished or just poorly coded or what was going on exactly. Also learning a little more about the developers. However, I also am stressing this whole video about ambiguity and uncertainty, and I understand that's where some of that comes from, so I'm not so sure if that could be implemented perfectly. I'm less saying that it's an objective flaw with the story that it lacks this, and more so that I would have found it interesting to go into that more, but I also understand that that could potentially have taken away from the story, hence why it wasn't put in. There you have it. 2 tales of obscurity. Was this just an excuse for me to read some creepypastas? Maybe a little bit, but them being narratives about lost and mysterious games, I've always linked them in my mind, and the appeal of them, I feel, is the appeal of many other things, especially our modern-day lost media hunts. I also found Mr. Mix and Swirly Headman Yowie while I was looking this up, so there's that too. Love wins. They tap into what, for me and I think many other people, is a really important part of a good mystery, which is just the story, regardless of the truthfulness of anything. Not to say that isn't an important factor either, though. I'm a huge fan of Panchico, and I'd say their music has genuinely done a lot for me, and that started as a lost media mystery, so that's something where it being real mattered, but still. I think whether or not that they realize it, there's a lot of people who don't engage with mysteries with the idea of wanting to find out the answers or caring that it's true. They're just there to be engaged by a story. True or false, it doesn't matter, they just want to follow along. Like, if Bigfoot was truly real, is that gonna affect your life? Are you gonna go out and find him? Maybe if you're some poor hunter who is out in the woods, you might get, mauled to death by Bigfoot, but then that probably still would have happened, regardless of if we knew if he was real or not. You would just say it was a bear. Sorry, sucks to suck. And like, if A Day with SpongeBob SquarePants was a real movie, would you go out and watch it? Probably not, because everything we know pointed to it being a really shitty movie. But then again, some people love bad movies like that. I think there's this cycle that people like myself go through, especially if you got to be in that certain bracket of the semi-early internet, where you kind of get upset in learning that so many mysteries that intrigued you once aren't real. I remember between shows like Lost Tapes and Ghost Adventures and just all the odd conspiratorial videos I'd seen on YouTube, I had a fascination with things like aliens and the supernatural, and it was kind of heartbreaking to very quickly realize that, oh yeah, almost all of these are fake. And there was a small time when that genuinely did bother me a little bit as a teen, but you eventually come to realize that as much as there can be some extra intrigue in the mysteries that have a possibility of just being 100% true, there's still a level of enjoyment to be had just through the story of it all, even if it's all fake. Creepypastas are internet folklore, but unlike their ancestors, they're never really based in any hard fact. There is no Mr. Mix, and there is no theater. But they do draw from a shared well of inspiration. Both are based on the strange and odd games that really do exist in reality. There might not be a typing game that has gore in the files or is impossible to beat, but there are some strange edutainment games out there. I'll always take a chance to mention Roly-Poly no Nanakorobi Yoki, even if it's not as overtly scary as some YouTubers might make it out to be. And is it really too far-fetched to imagine a game like the theater existing? Maybe the extent of the Swirly Head Man, maybe not, but there are strange games out there, aimless ones, and ones that are almost certainly unfinished. Why not engross yourself in the story of one that's got an endless depth of mystery to it that players will never know, on a disc that might not even exist. Also, my friend told me to make fun of the rap rat creepypasta, so, yeah, apparat, guys.